During the next 2 years, dramatic changes would last for a lifetime. Victor Charles would be spending his last year or so living in his Encino house in San Fernando Valley. I returned to El Cajon with the hope that my father and mother had resolved their marriage problems, but underneath there was a fissure waiting to dissolve our family. I went to El Cajon Junior High School, and I felt like a fish out of water. When I was living with my Uncle Victor Charles, I was growing in a positive direction, but after returning, I was completely stalemated and bored. My family soon met a tragic fate when my mother Hilda was in Grossmont Hospital in La Mesa, California, for surgery on her lower spine. A short while after her surgery, my father Sonny told my two sisters and me, saying, "Your mother is dying. We need to go and say goodbye to your mother." I was numb and emotionally frozen. I felt nothing. It was so surreal. My mother had an 8-inch length and 3-inch width deep surgical opening on the lower portion of her back. She was dying from staph infection. The doctors gave her no hope of surviving. What we learned much later, when my father, knowing she was dying, he must have felt guilty, and so he confessed to her that he recently had an affair with another woman. At that point in time, he believed she would soon die, and no one else would ever know what he said except for her. Why he chose to tell her is anyone's guess, but in doing so, it would lead to a divorce in March of 1967. My mother miraculously survived and spent 4 months in Grossmont Hospital and another month in recovery at her parents' home. When she returned to our home, my father was then living elsewhere. Throughout those darkened days, when we were sleeping, I would hear my mother crying in her empty bed every night. I was angry and confused, because my whole world had been turned upside down. I wished all the more to be living in Encino once again with my Buono family, but unfortunately, that was not to be for me. I eventually went to live with my father, Sonny, on Washington Avenue in El Cajon, California, and I was attending El Cajon High School in the 9th grade. Our family was completely fractured during 1966. All my hopes and dreams when we were a united family were now gone forever, and there was only black horizons and the unknown for me to see. In January of 1966, Victor Charles was playing in the role of Colonel Hubris in the television program The Man from U.N.C.L.E., titled The Deadly Goddess Affair, starring Robert Vaughn and David McCollum. It was released on January 16, 1966, and the executive producer was Norman Felton. The one major element missing with Victor Charles when entering into 1966 was him not being in the company of legendary Betty Davis, Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Bing Crosby, and many others that he acted with before. His performance in Dean Martin's The Silencers, playing in the role of Tongue Tease, was released on February 18, 1966. and it was the beginning of Victor Charles's drought of not being cast in quality motion pictures any longer. During that time, he soon would lose his Encino house. He did perform in another Perry Mason television program titled The Case of the Twice Told Twist, playing in the role of Ben Huggins. It was released on February 27, 1966, and the executive producer was Gail Patrick Jackson. The character he played was the leader of a gang who stole cars for a living. I've always found it to be ironic that my Uncle Victor Charles was given so many gangster and villainous roles in television and motion pictures, when he most likely had captured the characteristics of the real mafia men who knew when he was a young boy in San Diego. He was taught to be an actor within classic Shakespearean productions and classic American plays at the Oak Globe Theater, but Hollywood producers and casting directors only saw him acting in the world of violence, thievery, and death that his father once had lived before. Why didn't Hollywood cast Victor Charles in a sensitive role like being a college professor teaching young students about the classic years of history? Why didn't Hollywood cast him as a Catholic priest in the slums of New York City in the 1950s, reaching out to violent young men who were killing one another? Why couldn't my Uncle Victor Charles be seen as a generous and loving man when being an actor in Hollywood? There were numerous motion pictures that were written by screenwriters with noble storylines filled with meaningfulness and dignity. Instead of making Victor Charles look like a hero and kind person, they chose to turn him into a monster that robbed, pillaged, and would kill as many people as he could. Hollywood placed Victor Charles mostly in three categories: buffoonery, horror pictures, and nonsensical B-graded motion pictures. He was better than that, but Hollywood didn't allow him the dignity he deserved as being a trained classic Shakespearean actor who had a brilliant mind and a golden tongue when speaking amusing and meaningful words. What it came down to was about money. Money to make a living in Hollywood. Money to remain active as an actor in television and motion pictures, and money to pay his monthly bills and mortgage. Hollywood didn't believe he could play a role as a loving husband or a father guiding his children through life. Hollywood denied his sensitivity, and they replaced it only with fright for his gore-loving audiences. For the need of money and fame, Victor Charles had to surrender his dignity because Hollywood wouldn't allow a 6'3" 350-pound young man to become a hero. The hero roles, apparently, were only reserved for slim and handsome men in those days. My Uncle Tony once told me when Victor Charles was acting as King Tut in 1966 to 1967 in the Batman series, he came home growling, "They're turning me into a whore." And the television program Batman was titled The Curse of Tut, starring Adam West as Batman and Burt Ward as Robin, and it was released on April 13, 1966. On the next day, on April 14, 1966, Victor Charles performed in Batman titled The Pharaoh's in a Rut. On April 22, 1966, Victor Charles was looking for a place to film his new and original motion picture, The Reluctant Vampire, written by Bob Gary. And in a Gene Miller article, he said, "I just bought the script and I would like to direct the film myself and play in only a cameo role. I've directed at the Old Globe Theater in San Diego, where I got my start, but I'm anxious to try my hand at filmmaking. In fact, I've bought a complete 16mm setup and I've made quite a number of 10 and 15-minute films which have helped me to a better understanding of my work as an actor, as well as providing valuable experience and insight for directing. I was reared in a Catholic school, St. Augustine, and from my earliest years I wanted to become a priest or doctor. When I was 18, I worked one summer at the Globe and I was given the title role in Volpone. I was hooked from then on. I decided that the chief reason the priesthood appealed to me was the wardrobe, and my ambitions as a doctor were limited to that great scene when I would emerge from the operating room, pulling off the gloves and shaking hands with the grateful father whose son's life I had just saved. I'm glad I realized in time what my real calling is. Even though my start was in the theater, I find myself more and more captivated by films and television. Both seem to be more challenging for this reason. In theater, you must liquefy your own personality and pour it into the skin of another character. But in films, you only liquefy part of it. You must leave large lumps of yourself sticking out. And I have plenty of advantage in that department. That's because films want an image, not a characterization, and therein lays the challenge. Besides, I don't know whether it's my Catholic upbringing or what, but I deplore the state of the theater today. I feel that plays like Virginia Woolf and The Toilet degrade the human spirit. I prefer to think my objections are not religious, but purely a matter of taste. Certainly, there is truth in these plays. It's also true that children soil diapers. But I wouldn't want to see that sort of display on stage. Serious filmmakers are really not guilty of these lapses in taste and selectivity. That brings us to the question of censorship. Yes, I feel it's necessary, and yes, I think it's bad. I know that's a contradiction, but it's my honest opinion. It would take a wiser man than I to figure out how it could be arranged without entirely violating freedom of artistic expression. But just as cigarette packages must warn that smoking is a health hazard, I feel that young minds and impressionable older minds should be warned of the danger of lewd and salacious theater and films. I play a dual role of two zany twin brothers. As far as movies are concerned, I'm waiting for my own Marty, or Henry VIII, or The Lodger. When such a role comes along, I will have arrived. It wasn't often for Victor Charles to be this transparent, and I do believe his Catholic upbringing and teachings from his mentor, Father John R. Ahern, did make freedom of speech a very complicated topic when he was censoring stage productions and motion pictures. When he clearly admitted his own contradictions, it must have bewildered him all the more. It probably cut him to the heart knowing most of his roles were murderers and thieves, and he may have wondered how the Catholic Church looked down upon him for doing that. He was conservative in various topics of the culture in America in 1966, and he attended at St. Augustine High School, Villanova University, and the University of San Diego, and all three of these institutions of education were dominated by the Catholic Church. When I was 16 years old, my generation was far more liberal than the one Victor Charles had while growing up in the 1940s and into the early 1960s. It was a whole new horizon for a young generation looking for answers and creating new realms of music, theater, and film that triggered a liberal revolution, changing thoughts and minds and overturning conservativeness practically everywhere and overnight. Victor Charles, when first stepping into Hollywood, was embraced by director Robert Aldrich, who was then considered as being one of the old gang of the golden years of Hollywood. He was surrounded by others like Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, Olivia de Havilland, and Joseph Cotten, who were reaching the end of their brilliant acting careers. He hardly ever was cast with the younger actors and actresses who would soon become Hollywood stars. He was mostly rubbing shoulders with those stepping out of Hollywood because of their ages and their loss of popularities among their fans. When Victor Charles joined the Batman series, many of the guest stars were also from an older generation. There was Burgess Meredith as the Penguin, Cesar Romero as the Joker, Vincent Price as Egghead, and Eli Wallach as Mr. Freeze. Victor Charles was only 27 years old then in his television and motion picture career. On March 8, 1965, when America sent military troops into Vietnam, Victor Charles probably didn't realize what kind of revolutionary movement the younger generation was having when marching through the city streets of America and protesting against the Vietnam War. He also, most likely, didn't realize in 1966 that in the early morning hours in Greenwich Village, New York City, there would be a revolutionary riot at the Stonewall Inn on June 28, 1969, with gays, lesbians, and transgenders fighting against the New York City police for their rights to love whomever they wanted. On January 22, 1973, Roe v. Wade would be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, making it a U.S. constitutional right for women to have legal abortions. He did later on write a poem against legal abortions that most likely upset many young and old women in America with his political and religious beliefs. Throughout the mid-1960s, there was a sexual revolution underway and was changing America. On June 13, 1969, the motion picture Blue Movie starred Viva and Lewis Walden, and it was written and produced and directed by Andy Warhol. The 1960s was a tidal wave crashing over the entire culture of America, and if you didn't know how to ride a political surfboard, you might find yourself drowning under the waves of politics and the many new thoughts coming from a young generation. There were liberal motion picture directors in Hollywood like Woody Allen, Robert Altman, Mel Brooks, Norman Jewison, Stanley Kubrick, and many others. Everything in the 1960s was going incredibly fast in the music world, television, and in motion pictures. There were up-and-coming actors and actresses like Woody Allen, Warren Beatty, Candice Bergman, Timothy Bawdens, Karen Black, James Caan, Julie Christie, Robert De Niro, Glenda Jackson, Dustin Hoffman, and many more. To be at the top of anything in life, it's virtually a must to have people around you that can open up doors for you. That is what took place with Victor Charles between 1958 to 1962. But now, in 1966, there were more doors being shut in his face than ever before. There were many news clippings criticizing Victor Charles's characters in television and motion pictures, but that is what he got by performing in numerous villainous roles. It's a shame that he wasn't given more quality roles in more classic settings that would have endeared him more to his audiences. But instead, he was only frightening them half to death. That was the price he had to pay by acting in poor, structured storylines filled with crimes and violence. The Victor Charles I knew was soft-spoken, amusing, and kind. Imagery in television and motion pictures often forge actors into something other than what they truly are. Victor Charles performed again in the television program The Wild Wild West, titled The Night of the Eccentrics, on September 16, 1966, and he also performed in two more Batman programs entitled The Spell of Tut and Tut's Case is Shut. There was a newspaper that was criticizing Victor Charles and comparing him to actor Maurice Evans, who was a steady character on the television program Bewitched. The writer favored Evans over Buono, but they both were seasoned Shakespearean actors. How ironic is that? Victor Charles and Maurice Evans. Both quality Shakespearean actors winding up on television only to act in buffoonery productions. I'm confident they were given a great sum of money, but it was the price they paid while working in television. I don't knock either of them, because everyone needs to earn a buck. But it's sad that they weren't cast in classical Shakespearean programs on television instead. Near the end of the year, Victor Charles was performing in his one-man Christmas show in Brunswick, New Jersey on December 13, 1966. My father Sonny and I moved away from El Cajon in mid-1967 and relocated at an apartment at 729 Mission Boulevard in South Mission Beach. We were living a short distance away from my Auntie Susie and her son Carl. I was a sophomore at La Jolla High School, where my Uncle Tony and David Francis went before me. My father and I were like two bachelors, and most of my dinners were at George's Cafe across the street from a liquor store on Mission Boulevard. I was 15 years old, and my expanded boundaries allowed me to do almost anything I wanted to do. My father's business was located in Santee, California, approximately 25 miles away from the beach, and he worked long hours and leaving me alone most of the time. My friends at La Jolla High School were sons of prominent and wealthy fathers, and they lived in beautiful estates where many millionaires resided. My father and I were living in a studio apartment, and we had only one bed to share together. The monthly rent was $65, and when my friends visited me, I felt like a pauper. but they were envious of me because I didn't have any parental oversight. We drank beer, smoked cigarettes, splashed in the waves of the Pacific Ocean, and we sat on the hot sands looking at all the pretty girls wearing bathing suits while walking by us under the sun. I believe it was at the end of 1967 when Victor Charles lost his Encino home. During that year, he performed in 4 Batman programs, acted in 1 stage production, and he only had a small cameo part in a so-so quality motion picture. Agent Jerry Rosen must have been desperate to get Victor Charles back on track of working with celebrity actors and actresses again. Victor Charles's star wasn't rising. It was falling. And he had to do something quickly to turn things around, or he would be losing his acting career in television and motion pictures. Starting off in 1967, Victor Charles performed in the television program The Wild Wild West, titled The Night of the Feathered Fury, on January 13, 1967. His role was Count Carlos Mansepi, and the producer was Michael Carrison. Once again, Victor Charles was playing in the television program of King Tut on March 8, 1967, in the episode of King Tut's Coup. Following that, he was a guest star in the television program of The Cat on March 26, 1967. Victor Charles performed in the television program The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., titled The Phi Betty Killer Affair, on June 4, 1967, and he had a few words to share, saying, "I'm absolutely convinced that one's stature determines the type of role which he will be permitted to play. If one is unable to see his shoelaces while standing up, he's a bad guy. No doubt that's why villains are called heavies. As villains go, this Sedbrook fellow is rather lightweight, but he's still a villain, and therein lays the crux of my comment. I've been a professional rotter in movies and on television for 6 years. In that time, I have personally murdered some 50 human beings. I have been directly and indirectly responsible for the demise of another 75. My general history of robbery, pillage, tear, and brutality makes Genghis Khan look like Mary Poppins. The sex life of a Hollywood villain is virtual nil. I would appear that bad guys don't have a very happy home lives. I'm seldom permitted to have a wife or children. The closest I ever came to children on the screen was once when I kidnapped Loretta Young's daughter, but the policeman made me give her back. I lost 50 pounds, not that you'd ever know it. It's like the difference between 0 and 10 degrees. It's still cold. The difference between 350 and 400 pounds is still pretty fat. And a short time later, on July 27, 1967, he was playing King Tut again in the episode of Batman's Waterloo. Victor Charles soon played the role of Mr. Memory in the television program Dick Tracy, titled The Plot to Kill Nato, and it was only 27 minutes in length. There was no date of the month or day in 1967 and no other newspaper clippings of it. The summary of the program reads, "Supervillain Mr. Memory has 3 ambassadors set to attend a secret NATO conference about the Northern European defense system kidnapped in order to derail NATO and benefit an unnamed group or nation led by a man named Major Power. Chip Patton turns to his best man, Dick Tracy, to rescue the ambassadors and keep the conference on track. William Self was the executive producer at 20th Century Fox. On September 14, 1967, he played in the role of Mr. Cove in the television program Daniel Boone, in the episode of The Ballad of Sidewinder and Cherokee. The executive producer was Aaron Rosenberg. The only picture Victor Charles performed in during 1967 was Who's Minding the Mint? He played a small role as the captain. Here are a few of the names of the other actors: Jim Hutton, Walter Brennan, Bob Denver, Joey Bishop, Jamie Fair, and Jack Kilford. In one of the newspapers it printed, Victor Buono is the highlight of all this insanity. Bono's most distinguished moment comes when his craft folds up and he bravely sinks into the murky depths of the sewer, waving a tiny American flag. Victor Charles played King Tut in Batman once again on October 19, 1967, in the episode of The Unkindest Tut of All. And to top off the year of 1967, Victor Charles performed in playwright Stead Turkel's play On the Stage at the Mendelssohn Theater on December 1st, 1967, in the stage production of Amazing Grace. It was produced by the New Play Project of the University of Michigan. As the year of 1967 was coming to an end, I don't believe my Uncle Victor Charles believed he was a young Orson Welles or Sidney Greenstreet, because he wasn't in demand in any classic motion pictures. Going into 1968 was a major drought for him by not working in quality motion pictures and for the lack of playing roles in television programs. My father and I left South Mission Beach and we moved into an apartment at 365 Bonaire Street in La Jolla, California. We were only a few minutes away from the beautiful Winning Sea beach, and it was only a 15-minute walk for me to get to La Jolla High School. We had our own bedrooms. We had a large living room, one bathroom with a bathtub and shower, and a nice-sized kitchen to cook in. We definitely were coming up in the world because his business was succeeding and making us financially more secure. Victor Charles moved away from his Encino home sometime before or shortly after 1968. It must have been one of his darkest moments since going up to Hollywood in 1962, and things were looking rather bleak because of lack of work in television and motion pictures. His agent, Jerry Rosen, departed from him sometime in late 1967 or early 1968. I wish I knew what came between them, because they were very close during those last 7 years or so. Victor Charles did get another agent, and I can't recall his name, but later on, around 1970, his new agent would soon bring a big surprise to Victor Charles's life. Victor Charles soon moved into the Monkey House in the Yamashiro grounds above the Graham's Chinese Theater at 6925 Hollywood Boulevard, and the description of the Monkey House goes like this. Originally built to house a collection of monkeys, the namesake Monkey House was built like a cave, made of chicken wire and plaster on the inside, where the monkeys could sleep. An outdoor area featured small ponds and swings. In the late 1950s, the Monkey House was converted to an apartment and rented to celebrities like Randy Prince, whose father owned much of the Hollywood Boulevard. Prince's lavish parties became well known around Hollywood. My father Sonny and I visited Victor Charles and my grandma Mert at the Monkey House in Hollywood in 1968. Grandma Mert told us a funny story about the day when she went out to the swimming pool to sunbathe and she saw a naked man laying by the pool. She obviously felt uncomfortable because it was only she and him, and she didn't want to keep looking at his transparent anatomy any longer. She immediately returned to her home and told Victor Charles what she just saw and wanted to know who that man was. He went to look at the pool, and when he returned, he calmly said to her, "If you've watched the television Western Bonanza, Mother, you just saw Adam Cartwright's Family Jewels, and the man you were looking at is actor Pernell Roberts." I'll never forget her smile and her hard laughing, and I also thought she might have liked what she saw. On December 1st, 1969, Victor Charles was speaking in the town hall to the Woman City Club with his one-man show, and 8 days later he was doing the same by speaking at the Chamlin College in their Ara Allen Chapel. In closing out the decade of the 1960s, he said, "I attribute my start in acting to my grandmother, who constantly reminded me as a child to stand straight and to speak distinctly. At the age of 19, I was ready to conquer Hollywood, but I was a villain and they weren't selling that year. So I returned to San Diego to teach English for 1 year before trying Hollywood again." It was clear to see that Victor Charles was struggling at the end of 1969 while being in a drought of lack of quality roles in television and motion pictures. It was a smart move to reinvent his image throughout the states of America by intimately speaking to students in colleges and in women ladies' clubs. He started turning back to the theater stage, where he first was recognized as a fine Shakespearean actor in 1959 at the Old Globe Theater. He was being drawn outside the borders of America to perform in European motion pictures because he wasn't being offered quality roles in Hollywood anymore. He was now 30 years old at the end of 1969, and he was a seasoned television and motion picture star. He mostly was known as the actor in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, who received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. He was known as the actor who performed with Bette Davis, Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, and Dean Martin. To the younger generation in the mid-1960s, Victor Charles would be remembered by playing in the role of King Tut in the Batman series on television between the years of 1966 and 1968. My father Sonny and I drove up to Malibu in 1969 to the new house that Victor Charles and my grandma Mert were living in. When we arrived, Victor Charles took us outside, showing the view of the Pacific Ocean, and then he pointed to his next-door neighbor's house owned by actor Raymond Burr, who played in the role in the television program Perry Mason. Victor Charles's single-story house on the cliff of Malibu was much bigger than the Monkey House in Hollywood, and we soon were surprised to see my step-grandfather Victor Francis Buono there to help move Victor Charles's belongings from Hollywood to Malibu. Apparently, After nearly 10 years of imprisonment, he finally was released, and he was now a free man. I don't recall if my father was aware that we would be seeing Victor Francis that day, or how he felt after seeing him. That was one of the family characteristics by keeping emotions secretly quiet and buried. I believe my father learned that trait when growing up, to keep his mouth shut and never squill his emotions to any others. Surprisingly, I was told to ride along with my step-grandfather Victor Francis back to the Monkey House in Hollywood to pick up a few of the last items left behind. There we were, sitting and driving in the car to Hollywood, and I can't recall having a long conversation at any time while driving there and back to Malibu. We were together for about 3 hours, and the one thing I remember most was silence. I didn't know anything about why he was sent to prison or anything about the robbery and murder of mafia boss Tony Mirabile. I didn't know anything, but only that he went to prison, and naturally, I would never ask him, "Oh, what was it like in prison, Grandpa?" I certainly wouldn't, and I didn't. And he also didn't know anything about me. He must have been terribly uncomfortable, and he didn't ask me, "What have you been doing with your life, Wayne?" I wish we did have a conversation, but looking back, I understand why we didn't. I think we both wanted to, but we didn't know how to melt the ice. Too many years had passed by, and frankly, we were just two strangers driving in a car to Hollywood and back to Malibu. Sadly, I never had another opportunity to see him or get to know him, and that is a damn pity for both of us, because I wish I had known him better after his release from prison. But I will always remember him taking me by my hand to Belmont Park and South Mission Beach as a young lad in the happier days of his life, where the wooden roller coaster was king of the park, and playing at a booth where we tossed dimes in jars and eating cotton candy with my step-grandfather Victor Francis. My great-grandmother, Myrtle Bell Keller Bolkovich, who I called Granny Grunts, was born on April 18, 1886, in Essex, Ontario, Canada, and she had just died. She was an important member of the Buono family, and especially for Victor Charles, by teaching him how to become an actor. Everyone loved her, and when she passed away at 82 years old on December 15, 1969, we all knew we had been blessed by her inspirations, talents, and her wonderful common sense and wisdom. I spent a night with her in bed as a young lad, and she gave me a jackknife for a gift. I sat in her bed in the morning watching television and whittling on my thumb with my jackknife. And when she saw my bloody thumb, she didn't scold me, but she lovingly took the jackknife from my hand, folded it, and put it in my pocket and kissed my forehead. I will never forget my Granny Grunt's kindness. During 1970, my father Sonny purchased a single-story house at Devon Court in South Mission Beach, and it was only a 2-minute walk away from my Auntie Susie's double-story house on the boardwalk. My Uncle Tony was married and living in Hermosa Beach, and my Uncle David Francis was also married and living in Manhattan Beach, California. They were only about a 7-minute drive away from each other's houses. I lived with my father for a short while, and in September of 1970 I moved to Waialua, Hawaii, with my girlfriend and her mother. This was the true beginning of my many adventures at 17 years old. Victor Charles gave a very odd bit of information to one of his one-man show audiences saying, "I will be married for the first time. My fiancée will make the official announcement in 10 days and she is a set designer. It was a long search for me to find the woman I wanted to marry, and this one can do things with an iron to shirt a collar." He was most likely referring to his pretend bride-to-be, Peggy Kellner, who has been the set designer and costume designer for many years, starting in 1954 at the Oak Globe Theater in San Diego, California. This little bit of interest, before or later, never was brought up by him ever again. My guess would be he was shielding himself from being seen gay from the public, and by saying this little tiny white lies, he created a different image of him in their eyes. He most definitely lived out his life as a bachelor. And Peggy Kellner had only married once, and that man wasn't my Uncle Victor Charles Buono. I just now giggled after writing this bizarre episode of his life. On March 14, 1970, Victor Charles was performing his one-man show at the Knife and Fork Club of Davenport, Iowa, and he said, "My thesis is that in order to make a theater, you must have a storyteller and a listener." When Victor Charles witnessed the beginning of the 1970s, he probably couldn't understand why he was having such bad luck. It wasn't that he was performing poorly, but it might have been his new agent not getting quality roles for him in television, on stage theaters, and in motion pictures. I did hear that his new agent embezzled him, and the agent was taken to court, found guilty, and he served time in prison. He also had to turn over his property in Apple Valley, California, into the hands of my Uncle Victor Charles. I haven't the date of the year this took place, but it had to have happened between 1970 and 1974. That was when Victor Charles relocated to his new Apple Valley Ranch near Victorville, California, and he lived there for the rest of his life. Unfortunately, Victor Charles's woes were not over with, because there was still one motion picture in 1970 that he had performed in that would be his very worst reviews to date. The motion picture was titled Up Your Teddy Bear in June 4th, 1970. The major actors were Julie Newmar, Wally Cox, and Victor Charles. The film was chock full of nudity and nasty dialogue, and it truly was one of the most bizarre motion pictures that he had placed his name on. It was now coming back at him like a screaming tornado throughout numerous bad reviews in newspapers across America. That was the conclusion of the productions Victor Charles performed in 1970. This must have been a wake-up warning for him that if he had another year like that, He just might have to go on unemployment. In the 1960s, that made him a star on stage, in television, and in motion pictures, were now ancient Hollywood history. He needed to reinvent himself as who he was in the eyes and minds of his audiences throughout America. It was an absolute must or break. And that is exactly what he started to do in 1971 by traveling through numerous states of America, giving his solo one-man performance of reciting classic stories, prose, and comedic poetry. He had to live up to his prior creative victories of winning 3 Atlas Globe Awards for Best Actor of the Year at the Oak Globe Theater and getting an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor in the Motion Picture, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. A whole brand new decade was facing him, and he was definitely up for the challenge of his lifetime by not giving up. It was 1971. I was 18 years old and I was living in Los Angeles, California. I was working on a Coachella date farm under the hot summer sun near the ending of the year, and I soon relocated up to Burlington, Washington. My father Sonny was still living alone in South Mission Beach and enjoying his bachelor status while dating various women. It was the early 1970s where you could sleep overnight in a Motel 6 for only $6 and fill up your 12-gallon gas tank for only $3.84. A draft beer then was only 25 cents a glass, and so was a pack of cigarettes. Food was inexpensive, and you could live in a studio apartment near the beach for only $65 per month. The young generation was traveling throughout America, driving their VW buses and living in communes in the rolling hills of California and elsewhere. It was the hippie generation, and I jumped headfirst into a whole new way of life. Victor Charles was quoted in a Wilton Jones article discussing his ability of writing poetry on October 31st, 1971, saying, "Other people doing my material, so when I refused, Mr. Bedell, a very nice man, asked me to do them myself. You might say I know too much about poetry to claim to be a poet. I can joke and rhyme, though. Maybe I'll write a poem someday. I wish I had more time to be bad." With the nomination, my price and my billing had to triple overnight. I had a lot of offers, but no good roles. I took them anyway and went straight into the string of films, each worse than the last. Now I may be fat, but I'm not lazy. I've got to work and I've got to do something to make people love me more. I'm still very much an actor. Nobody intimates me. There are no Victor Buono impressions, and I want to keep it that way. I'm not a character actor, just a fat actor. I could play Romeo, although I need quite a Juliet. They are starting to write TV roles for me now. I play a lot of Badman type 47B, where I wear silks, look sideways without turning my head and let the hurry beat me up. But I'm not typed. I love food, but I love applause more. So I want to replace me with another and add an extra 20 years to my career. At 33, I shouldn't be tired enough for it to affect my work at the end of the day. What would I do with myself at 190 pounds? My Uncle Victor Charles was absolutely honest with every word he said in this article. I love the one where he said, "Now I may be fat, but I'm not lazy. I've got to work and I've got to do something to make people love me more." This just made me cry of thinking of him.